friends, it's Unicorn, and today I'm bringing you my January wrap-up. I have finished 4 books in January, which is really great considering that I didn't read anything in the first 2 weeks of the month. And the other thing that I'm thrilled about is out of the 4 books are 5 stars reading for me, which make it a 5-star month in January, and there's no better way to start a year like this. So without further ado, let's talk about the books. The first book I read is I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki by Baek Sehee, translated from Korean by Anton Hur. If you have followed me for a while, you'll know that last year I read a book translated by Anton Hur called Cursed Bunny, and it was the first book of last year, and I gave that book a 5-star. And this book is also translated by Anton Hur, and I give this book a 5-star. I see a pattern here. After I read Cursed Bunny, I really wanted to pick up more translation by Anton Hur because I kind of trusted his taste. And the reason why I picked up this book is I saw him on Instagram one day. He was complaining that for the last time, I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki is a book title that I'm promoting, not that I wanted to die, because Instagram kept sending him mental health check-in messages and he was kind of fed up. I was kind of happy that social media has a mental health check-in system, but also find it really hilarious. So that's why I picked up this one out of curiosity and also out of my trust for Anton Hur as a translator, and he did not disappoint me. This is a memoir for the author Baek Sehee, or her journal about her getting treatment for her depression. She has a habit of recording her conversation with other people, so later on she can re-listen to it and kind of reflect on it and kind of like self-correct in a lot of situations. So a lot of this book is the conversation between Baek Sehee and her psychiatrist. The book hooked me on the prologue for 3 separate times. The first one is the very first sentence of this book where she explains how did the book title come from, and the second time is when the author was talking about in mental health there's this area between completely fine and devastating that people tend to ignore. And the third time is when the author says this: I've always thought that art is about moving hearts and minds. Art has given me faith. Faith that today may not have been perfect but was still a pretty good day. Or faith that even after a long day of being depressed, I can still burst into laughter over something very small. I've also realized that revealing my darkness is just as natural a thing to do as revealing my light. Through my very personal practice of this art, I hope I can find my way into the hearts of others, just as this book has found its way into your hands. I was sold after I read this. One of the topics that this book is discussing is that how people sometimes can have depression but also be functional and also have joy. In my opinion, this is also the balance that you need to you need to learn to manage when you are living with depression. I had this very conversation with one of my friends last year where we were talking about depression, and he thought depression was like having a cold. After you recover, you kind of get over it. But in my opinion, depression is more like having high blood pressure, where you have to constantly manage it and learn how to best use your resources to keep it under control. So that's why this book, especially the first half, kind of resonates with me a lot. When I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, this book is just talking about my life. But later on, as I was reading this book, I found out that it's very different from my experience because of course it's the author's personal journey, but I started to grow appreciation about it just because of the honesty of the author. I feel like this book is very personal and the author put herself in a very vulnerable places. Sometimes when reading the journal, I felt like I invaded her personal territory. So I really appreciate how the author was willing to show us all the things that is going on in her mind and also her life, and present us the truth of living with depression and anxiety. But don't get me wrong, this is not the only format or the only side of the truth of dealing with depression and anxiety. Everybody has their own different experiences. I know that from my first-hand experience. I'm just saying that all the things that author was presenting is so vulnerable and so valuable. I understand the subject matter of this book can be very sensitive and sometimes it's very uncomfortable in some chapters for us to read about, but I think it's a great reminder for us that sometimes our uneasiness is other people's reality that they need to live through. I give this book a 5-star, even though the writing is not necessarily its strength. It's just a journal, but it was just very personal to me, and I really I'm glad I read it. The second book I read in January is also a heavy and personal one, but for completely different reasons. It's a graphic memoir called The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. This is Thi Bui's story talking about her family story, mainly her parents, how they grew up in the war-torn Vietnam, got together and escaped to America to build a better life for their children. This book is stunning both narratively and artistically. It started with Thi Bui's personal labor story that's also got her to thinking what does family mean and got her to start discovering the story of her parents and making connections from there. I really like a quote from this book in the first chapter. It says, "Family is now what I have created, not what I have born into." I love it in different levels. I think there's a pun here where I started to understand a few days after I finished this book. Because at first I thought she was just talking about her having kids and she started to create families, which is true, but I also think there's another layer to this sentence because she started to discovering her parents' stories and she started to think them as individuals who have background stories instead of just viewing them as her parents. So she started to discover the humans besides the roles of parents. In this way, it strengthens the family connection between her parents and her, which also fit into the I have created a family kind of mentality. And for the content itself, I learned a lot. We often hear a lot of things about the Vietnamese War, especially in America. We hear a lot from the Americans' point of view, of course, but we don't necessarily have a lot of representations about the Vietnamese people and how they went through the war and what does the war mean to their day-to-day life and how does that impact their life. Thi Bui's parents' story and her illustration about it showed us the poignant truths about how people needed to do in order to survive. I also think graphic memoir or graphic novel is a brilliant way to present stories like this because you can do so much with art. One of the chapters, Thi Bui was having a conversation with her dad about his traumatized youth, and she actually drew her dad as a teenage boy at the age when her dad went through the whole thing, and she was having conversations as a grown woman with this teenage boy. I think this is brilliant because in order for the people who's traumatized to heal, they often have to go back and to have conversations with the past self too. And same things apply to when we were trying to understand people who are traumatized. We needed to have the conversation with them in the past. This is a very abstract concept, but with illustrations, you're able to see that in front of your eyes, and it was so powerful. I was also heartbroken to see how the trauma was passed down generations to generations, even though they tried to create the best for their children, hence the title, The Best We Could Do. The third book I read in January was a long time coming. It is The Story of the Lost Child by Elena Ferrante, translated from Italian by Ann Goldstein. I was binge reading the whole series. Last year, I read them back to back each month, but I couldn't get to the final one before my depression hits me. So I finally finished this one, and I'm both so happy and so sad. Happy because I have finished the story and it was as great as I expected. Sad because I have to say goodbye to the whole series, at least for a while. This is a great conclusion about the Neapolitan series, and if you didn't know, the first book in the series is called My Brilliant Friend, which also has a TV adaptation from the series also called that. It started with the protagonist Elena in her elderly years. One day she got a phone call from her friend Lila's son talking about Lila just suddenly disappeared, and that prompted her to recall all the stories happened between her and Lila and also their community, and started to write down their stories from their childhood years. They grew up in a small town in Naples, and of course when you are young, the whole community seems to be the whole world to you. This is exactly how they felt, and of course with years going by, things have changed, characters grow up. What I love the most about this book or the whole series is that we can not only see the changes and the growth of the characters, but we can also see the changes and growth of their communities, and all of which are echoing the changes in Italy in this turbulent time, or even the whole world, which makes everything so complicated and so tangled together, and it's fantastic to read about. It shows the most from this very last book because you started to see a lot of consequences from the clues that the author planted in the first 3 books. Some of them you may have expected, but some of them you will never guess. Nothing is convenient, nothing is easy, but everything is so natural, and it's such a delight to discover them all. And besides the plot design, the sentence-to-sentence writing is also fascinating. The story also talks a lot about the power of language. A lot of times the characters speak Italian, but they also speak dialect when they have a bolder emotions and give the whole thing a more stronger layer of power. I was so immersed in the story and just couldn't get myself out. It is for sure a story that will give you a reading hangover, and I was in it for a couple days after I read this book. Although I have just finished it, but I've already wanted to reread it with a closer eye. The last book I read in January is a nonfiction, is The Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe. I picked up this book on a whim in the train station. I was standing among all the mystery thrillers and self-help books, and this was the only one that I was interested in. So I picked it up, and oh my, I didn't expect to like it so much. A little bit of a background story of the Sackler family that I didn't know before I read this book. The Sackler family were immigrated to America around the Second World War, and almost all the family members has a medical background. The first generation of Sacklers who made their names out there were 3 very ambitious brothers. They started off by developing medicines and also went into the advertising industry of the medical field, and eventually the Sackler family became huge in the pharmaceutical industry. One of the drugs that they were selling as painkillers has opioid, which lead to the addiction and also overdose problems in America that killed many people, hence the opioid epidemic in America. At the same time, the whole family was also obsessed with their names and legacy. They were huge donors to museums and universities, including the Met that I just visited before I read this book. And this book is just about how the family started, developed, and eventually became a cruel money-making machine and abandoned all the ethics in medical industry. The book has 3 parts. The first one reads like a biography of Arthur Sackler, who was one of the 3 brothers that I was talking about. And the second part and the third part of the book became an investigation of the business scandal that involved the Sackler families and also so many parties in the pharmaceutical industry. I have a minor complaint about the first part of the book, which actually has nothing to do with the book. Is that the family's obsession with success makes me so tiresome. I, by nature, I'm not very good with dealing with the go type of people. So in the first section, I got so stressed out, to be honest. But I came to understand the necessity of writing about it in the later part of this book, because by presenting us the mentality of the Sackler family, the author was able to paint us a better picture of the whole business scandals. This is such an interesting family. They are so into capitalism, and they were kind of blind because of that, and they were willing to abandon humanity, if I may, but at the same time, they also wanted to be remembered as great people, great family. It's just so bizarre. Besides the bizarre nature of the Sackler family story, I also liked the observation of the author and his commentary about the pharmaceutical industry. I liked when he called out the sexism and also the racism in the industry. I feel like that's very necessary. And more importantly, I liked how this book discussed and reflected on the topic of addicts, how people became addicts and how the society was treating them, how the system was harming them instead of helping them. Addiction is a systematic problem, not individual problems. But business like Sackler family, they're willing to use the nature of opioid to generate more and more profit for themselves instead of really helping people. Because of the bad ethics of the advertising and of the industry, patients sometimes can be addicted to painkillers even if they were following the prescriptions precisely. This is a discussion we're actually having more and more nowadays. I like how this book did many research and interviews and investigations to present us the reason behind it. Overall, very informative book, great writing, and I learned so much from it. And that concludes my readings for January. I had such a great reading month or great reading 2 weeks that I'm really happy about, and I'm now ready to read anything and everything. And please let me know if you have read any of the books that I mentioned, or what have you read in January, what did you like, what did you not like, and thumbs up to this video if you liked it. Stay healthy, stay safe. I'll see you in my next bookish video. Bye!